Thank you. Thanks so much, Ben, for those kind words. Thank you all for being here and for the pleasure to speak with you. Just quickly, by way of formality and first things coming first, on behalf of all the Australians in the room and the rest of our compatriots back in Australia, our best wishes for the Euro final tomorrow. We believe in you, notwithstanding what's happened in the past. We know you can do it. We know you can do it. It's really such a blessing to be here. In fact, the last time I was in this room, my wife and I had the blessing of spending a couple of years here in Oxford, and I was studying here. The last time I was in this room, I was actually doing an exam. It was my last exam, and it was on some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about, but that was a far more traumatic day than this is. It's much nicer to be here. There weren't anywhere near as many smiling faces then. One thing I learned pretty quickly after coming to Oxford in those 2 years of studying here was that there are broadly two types of people that come and study in Oxford. There are people who have read Leo Tolstoy, and there are people who pretend to have read Leo Tolstoy. And I was very loudly and proudly in the latter camp. But during my time here, I did read something of Tolstoy. And one of the things I read was a short story that most people have not really heard of, even Tolstoy readers. Some of you will definitely have heard of and read this. The title of it is interesting. The title is, How Much Land Does a Man Need? That's the title of the story. How much land does a man need? And it tells the story of a Russian peasant farmer called Pakhom. And Pakhom, like most of us, wants to get ahead in life economically. He wants to grow his capital. He wants material wealth. He wants to be successful financially and economically. And he hears about a group of landowners in another part of the country called the Bashkirs. And there's two things that Pakhom knows about these Bashkirs. One is that they have a ton of land. And secondly, he hears that they are a bit dim. They're not that bright. And so he goes off and meets with the chief of the Bashkirs with a view to cutting a bit of a deal and maybe swindling them a little bit into selling him a big chunk of their land. And the chief of the Bashkirs, who's actually, it turns out, not that dim, he says, okay, Pakhom, here is the deal. Give us a nominal amount of money, let's say 500 rubles. I don't know the exact amount Tolstoy uses. And tomorrow morning as the sun rises, you choose any point on our land. And then for the rest of the day of sunlight, you can traverse on foot as much of our land as you want. And whatever you have enclosed the perimeter of by the end of the day of sunlight, that's how much land you get for the 500 rubles. The catch is that if you don't make it back to your starting point, by the time the sun sets, you get nothing. So you've got to calculate, you can't be too greedy, you've got to work out exactly how much you can cover. And Pakhom's pretty excited, right? He's thinking of acres and acres, hectares of land that he can cover in a full day of sunlight. And so the next day he gets up, he finds his spot, everyone's out watching, all the villagers have come, it's a big event, and he sets off. And he's covering quite a bit of land. But suddenly, it seems like he's not going to make it. The sun begins to set. He thinks he might have miscalculated. And so he has to sprint for the finish line. And the way Tolstoy writes it is quite beautiful. It's better than I'm paraphrasing now, but it's something along the lines of, Pakhom is racing against the shadow of the sun to get to his endpoint. And just microseconds before the sun dips behind the horizon, he hits his mark. He's secured for himself this enormous tract of land. But he's so exhausted and drained from the pursuit and from the day that he drops dead right there. And that's a bit of a dark story, sorry about that. It's the first talk, these guys will clean it up later. The reason that's powerful and symbolically incredibly relevant, particularly in a frame of economic unrest, is because it's this classic old tale of humankind wanting things, working for them, being industrious, being diligent, striving for excellence, calculating, predicting, planning, doing everything we can in our own strength, but then being blindsided by unforeseen circumstances, unforeseen factors, unforeseen, unpredictable events. Effectively being blindsided by the intrinsic volatility of the world around us. And there's no frame of reference or institutional frame in everyday life for which that's more relevant than in our economic frame. Our global economic and financial systems really do shape, even though they're invisible, they shape so much about how we live and what we do. how we define success, how we define our identity, our levels of anxiety. And at the moment, we are in a period of economic unrest, certainly here in the United Kingdom, but globally as well. Pretty much since COVID, there's been a particular type of turbulence around. Just this week, one of your Bank of England economists talked about how he foresees persistent sticky inflation and persistent moderate to high interest rates. That wasn't news that anyone wanted to hear. We've had very similar announcements in Australia. Also, your new Chancellor this week, Rachel Reeves, she confirmed that public debt in the United Kingdom, your government debt, has exceeded now 100% of GDP, gross domestic product. So if everyone just worked really hard for 1 year and didn't consume anything, and all of that working output was put towards public debt, it still wouldn't pay it off. And the irony of it is that the UK is actually in not that bad a shape compared to a lot of the other advanced industrial economies around the world. So things are tough. Things are anxious. Markets are okay, but they're kind of tender. Stock markets and equity markets, bond markets, it's all a little confusing. We're not sure what AI is going to do, what it's going to do to the future of employment. Our education systems are under strain. Our healthcare systems, as you well know here, are under strain. There is economic unrest and uncertainty. And so, in the midst of that, how can we find a way to navigate through it and to find some stability and rest with our economic uncertainty? There's so much that could be said and plenty that we could do, but I want to just share at least 3 things that we can do in order to navigate economic unrest and navigate the world and a time of economic unrest. Firstly, when it comes to thinking through and working through economic unrest, is that we can bring our principles. Bring your principles. The international and local economic systems that we've built for ourselves, they operate like many restaurants on a BYO basis when it comes to principles. We have to bring them ourselves. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, there was a guy from the United Kingdom that many of you will have heard of called Adam Smith that wrote probably the most seminal work, not the only work, and he didn't invent this out of thin air, but he was probably the most seminal thinker and writer on the area of what we call free markets. This idea that the best way to generate wealth and improve our quality of life and have as many people benefiting from technological advancements and their own skills and labour and productively allocating our resources, Smith's idea was that the best way to do that was with free markets. Let it all move freely. Let capital move freely. And capital is just a fancy economic word for money that's seeking to make more money, right? So Smith wrote this thing called The Wealth of Nations, and it just kind of turned the world upside down. It's pretty much still the most important piece of thinking that shaped our modern economic system. We still very much live under the influence of that thinking. The modern world that we've built is in large part a product of that thinking around free markets. And it's, as you would expect, studied a lot, in economics faculties and MBAs and business schools and leadership colleges as a really important set of principles. What most of us, though, forget, and what's almost never studied in any of those places, is another little essay that Smith wrote alongside The Wealth of Nations. And that was called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And what Smith was basically saying is that this free market thing is going to be really good. It's going to be transformative. It's going to unlock a lot of human potential. He foresaw what was going to happen. There's going to be great inventions. Our phones are going to get smarter. Our fridges are going to get smarter. Our cars are going to get faster and cleaner. Our houses are going to get better. All of this is going to happen. But we need to bring our own principles to this system. He actually mentions it in The Wealth of Nations, but then he writes this whole separate book as well. And he was writing, perhaps unsurprisingly, but it's no coincidence, from a Christian perspective. He's saying we've got to bring these principles because economics and this free market idea of just the free allocation of capital and money and resources in order to optimize for productivity and profits, it's not amoral. It's not that it's just neutral. There's no neutrality. It has its own kind of built-in default morality, and that is to turn everything into means and material. It's to instrumentalize everything just so we can optimize for productivity and profits, including people. If we're not careful, even people will get instrumentalized. They'll get commodified. It commodifies things. That's what this free market idea does. So we need to bring our principles to it. You can't just let the economy rip without any moral thinking or moral foundations and say, oh, it's just amoral, everyone has different moral thinking. That doesn't work. Every system always has some underlying moral principles. You can't get away from them. And it was Aldous Huxley, the atheist and writer, from all people, who said, he captured all of this and summarized it beautifully. He said, you can have good metaphysics or bad metaphysics, but you can't have no metaphysics. And metaphysics is just a fancy word for first causes and first principles. He said you can have good first principles and bad first principles, but you can't have no first principles. And when you try and run away from them and ignore the idea of first principles, you're probably going to have bad ones. And that's exactly what Smith is telling us in the theory of moral sentiment. So we've got to bring first principles at all times, but especially at a time of economic unrest. We've got to bring our principles. And what are they? There's plenty we could talk about, but at least two, I think, are particularly relevant. Charity and integrity. When times are tough economically, when you're worried about your job, when you're worried about your mortgage, about interest rates, about markets, about savings, about when's the right time to retire, about how we're going to get the kids through school and university, that is not a time to be giving up on these important Christian principles of charity and integrity. Charity comes alive when things are tough and uncertain. And so this will all look very different for different people. These are conscience issues, all ethical issues are, regardless of where you are in your faith journey. But when times get tough and uncertain economically, maybe now is the time to start giving to charity. Maybe now's the time to make a decision, if you're already giving, that is not something you're going to give up on, that you're going to displace and cut back on other spending. Maybe it's just the time you're going to reach out to people on your street when things are tough. Mow a lawn, offer to clean the windows, to do the dishes, to take someone a meal. It doesn't matter how much we're uncertain and anxious and struggle in uncertain economic times, there are always people in our spheres of influence that are worse off and more vulnerable. Maybe bringing first principles at a time of economic unrest is about doubling down on that. That's countercultural. That brings much more than clarity in the chaos. That brings renewal and light in the chaos. Secondly, integrity. When economic unrest and turbulence hits, it's easy to think that this might be an okay time to cut corners. And again, this will look like different things for different people, but it's quite simple what integrity is. We know there's a gut test, if you like. It's about being trustworthy, being accountable, paying our taxes, declaring our income correctly, doing the right thing in our dealings with insurers and with other actors in the economy as we buy and we sell. Charity and integrity, these are two of the most important first principles, and they're at the heart of what Smith was talking about. And it's no coincidence that he was talking explicitly from a Judeo-Christian moral framework. So firstly, we can and we should bring our principles. Secondly, we've got to rethink independence. We've got to rethink this idea of independence. Now, there's a movie from a little while ago now, maybe 6 or 7 years, called Martian, starring Matt Damon. Some of you will have seen it. Pretty good movie. And I'm going to spoil it, but you've had 7 years, you should have seen it. Still worth seeing. I have to spoil movies a lot when I speak. The movie starts with the first Martian space station, the first human Martian space station on the planet Mars. And the opening scenes depict an industrial accident, some kind of an explosion on this space station. And a couple of the astronauts are thrown back, and one seems to have been killed. And the rest of the astronauts, because there's a fire, there's an oxygen crisis, they have to launch an emergency evacuation in the rocket back to Earth. And as they're launching it, and the opening credits are still rolling, the camera pans back to Mars and to this supposedly dead body. And of course, he's not dead. He's just been knocked unconscious. And this is the character Mike Watney, played by Matt Damon. And now he's in this ridiculous situation where he has to somehow regenerate his oxygen supply and rebuild the station and make communication with NASA. And of course, ultimately, and most importantly, find a way to come home, to come back to Earth. And the spoiler is that he does make it home. It's also not really a spoiler because you're not going to cast Matt Damon and then kill him off halfway through the movie, right? That's just not going to work. So I take it back. No apology for the spoiler. He makes it back, and in one of the last scenes of the movie, this man now, Mike Watney, who's an international celebrity because he's been through this incredible ordeal, trapped on Mars, made his way back, did all these amazing things. He's now a lecturer at the NASA Academy, and he's speaking to a group of cadets, if you like, who are training to become astronauts. And they know what he's been through and his international status and celebrity. And he says to them, it's really important that you apply yourself while you're here. Because when you're out there, you're going to run into a problem. And if you solve that problem, you'll be given another problem. And if you solve that problem, you'll be given another problem. And he goes on and on like this. And then I think it's the last line of the movie. He says, and if you solve enough problems, you get to come home. If you solve enough problems, you get to come home. The reason I think that line is important is because that captures perfectly the modern cultural messaging out there that we are all told about how to navigate through not just economic unrest and uncertainty, but all unrest and uncertainty. It's a message of self-actualization, of lifting ourselves up by our own bootstraps, of thinking our way out of things, of working our way out of things, of sciencing our way out of things, of engineering our way out of things, of self-developing, of life hacking, of self-optimization. That's the message. It's a message of independence. It's that we can do this. We just have to dig deep and improve ourselves and lift ourselves up. And in large part, Damon's character in the movie does that. He does amazing things. He starts growing his own food, he regenerates the oxygen supply, he secures the electricity flow, he makes contact with NASA somehow, he reprograms the control unit. He does all kinds of amazing things. But in the end, how does he get out of there? He's rescued. They have to come back and get him. He does a lot, and he probably wouldn't have survived if he didn't do everything that he did. But in the end, they have to come back and get him. And what does it tell us, at least symbolically? It tells us something we all know deep down, that we're never really independent. We all depend on something, always. And that's perhaps no more true than in the economic sphere. It doesn't matter how well off you are and how well your investments are diversified. You might have savings in multiple currencies. You might be hedged. You might have stocks and bonds and multiple investment properties. You might have 3 kids and one's at Harvard and one's at Oxford and one's at Yale. And so even if a couple mess up, one's going to be okay to bail the other ones out. We can hedge and insure and strategically diversify and plan our way. But it doesn't really take much to show, like Pacom found out, that it can all come crashing down. It doesn't take much, a stock market crash, a governmental crisis, an unexpected war, a pandemic, a big dip in demand. And these are all kind of moderately problematic things. Even if you can somehow dodge all of that, and many of you here I know, highly functioning, highly educated, you've been highly successful, and that's fantastic. But then there are other things too that can eat their way into the economic unrest and in fact create even more existential unrest. Even if all your finances work and are in order and you can control it and keep it all stable, what about that drunk driver that runs a red light? What about that terrible and unexpected cancer diagnosis? What about that mental health breakdown? What about that relational breakdown? What about that bout of anxiety or social, emotional, mental dislocation? What about that spiritual crisis or that crisis of faith? These are all things that happen to all of us. These are thoroughly normal human things. They're just part of the reality that we're broken people living in a broken world. And so as independent as we'd like to think that we are, as much as we can and should be diligent and be focused, we have to ultimately remember that we're all dependent on something else. We're all finally and ultimately in need of rescue. So what does rethinking independence look like? Well, I think it first does look like taking responsibility and doing what we can with what we've got, like Mike Watney did. We have to use our intelligence, use our capacities, and that in an economic context might look like seeking financial advice or restructuring your savings or deciding what you want to cut back on, maybe being more intentional about budgeting. Maybe now's the time to ramp up your hours or think about an alternative source of income, or maybe it's time to start that business, take a risk, borrow some money. It might be time for others to pay down debt and stop borrowing money. It'll look like different things, but we should use our intelligence and our prudence and our wisdom and our experience to do what we can, to mitigate, to hedge, to be responsible with our finances. And you know what that looks like, depending on the situation in which you are. But secondly, once we've done all that we can reasonably do, we shouldn't hang our identity on that. We shouldn't hang our peace and our rest on that. We need to understand that we're dependent. And so what we ultimately need is something trustworthy, something or someone that's ultimately trustworthy in whom we can place our dependence and in whom we can anchor. So I come to my third and final point. We need to anchor outside of the storm. We need to anchor outside of the storm. And if you think about a storm, that's the only way that stability in some sense works. We have to anchor ourselves to something that's beyond the chaos, beyond the unrest, beyond the volatility. It doesn't matter how impressive your boat or your ship or your yacht is. It doesn't matter how many big screen TVs or bathrooms it's got. If it's in a storm, it's in a storm. It's subject to the turbulence of the storm. The only way to anchor it is to connect it to something that's outside the storm, either to a pier or to a jetty or to the sea floor. And we need to do that because our world, particularly our economic system and our financial system, is intrinsically uncertain and it's intrinsically unreliable. That uncertainty has been talked about widely and widely accepted now by economists and futurists and sociologists. They're telling us now that the world is more VUCA than ever before. Don't know if anyone's heard that term. VUCA, VUCA. The world is more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It's more VUCA. We're living in a VUCA world. It's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Some years ago, the statistician and social commentator Nassim Nicholas Taleb, he wrote a book called Black Swan, where he popularized this ancient term, the Black Swan. And many of you will have heard this. A Black Swan event is an event that we just didn't see coming. It kind of defied our expectations and our predictive models and our understanding of the world. And so there are plenty of obvious black swans that we've had just in recent times. 9/11, the attacks on the World Trade Center, that was, in many respects, a black swan. The global financial crisis in 2007-8 was a black swan. COVID, was the ultimate and probably most obvious black swan. But interestingly, these events seem to be becoming more and more and more. It seems to be ramping up. Now, I grew up in a little city in Australia, one of the best cities in Australia and the world, called Perth. And growing up in Perth, all the swans are black. They're all black. We only have black swans. We have so many, in fact. We have a river that runs through Perth. It's called the Swan River, right? That's how swan-centric Perth is. So many black swans. And yet the concept of the black swan, at least insofar as it's been popularized and used in economics and behavioral neuroscience and so forth, it's really happened in the North Atlantic. It's around here, continental Europe, America, Canada, and the United Kingdom, where most of the swans, as I understand it, are white. Is that right? You would assume so. And so when I was studying political economics and law, and I was taught about this concept of the black swan, having come from Perth, it was very confusing to me. I was like, this doesn't seem to make sense because all swans are black. In fact, I don't think I'd seen a white swan at that point. But as I've now, for the last 10 years or so, looked at the world and what's happening, it seems like the Perth paradigm of black swan thinking is much more in keeping with reality than the North Atlantic paradigm of black swan thinking. Because when you wake up today, all the swans are black. You look at the news headlines, the swans are black. You look at politics, the swans are black. You look at economics, the swans are black. There are black swans everywhere. It is VUCA. It's more and more VUCA. It's deeply uncertain, it's deeply unstable. And secondly, it's unreliable. You can't depend on it. The American poet Walt Whitman famously wrote, "When I peruse the conquered fame of heroes and the victories of mighty generals, I do not envy the generals their victories, or the president in his presidency, or the rich man in his great house." What's Whitman saying? The key is in the first phrase, conquered fame. When I peruse the conquered fame, what he's saying is that economic fame and success, material wealth, this financial advancement, all our kind of modern material consumerist metrics of success, that's all fame, quote unquote, that's going to be conquered. It's all subject to instability. It's all subject to unrest. It's not going to take much to wipe that away. A couple of thousand years before Walt Whitman wrote those words, Jesus Christ himself, even more famously and more importantly and more relevantly, said, "Do not store up for yourself treasures here on earth, where moth and rust consume and thieves break in and steal. Instead, store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not consume and thieves do not break in and steal." What does that look like, storing up treasures in heaven? Jesus is speaking to this instability. He's speaking to the VUCA-ness. He knew how VUCA it would be right now. In fact, it's always been VUCA when you look back. The great British journalist Malcolm Muggeridge said that history is just the same stuff happening over and over again to new people. We're just the newest people. This VUCA-ness is always there. Jesus says the way around it, the way to navigate the unrest, is to not worry about treasures here, store up treasures in heaven. What does that look like? It looks like a lot of things, but as I've said, at the very least, it looks like bringing your principles of charity and integrity to your economic and financial planning and behavior and thinking and giving and dealing. It looks like rethinking independence, doing what you can with everything that you've been given and blessed with, your education, your intelligence, your resources, financial and educational and otherwise. Doing what you can, but then ultimately accepting and humbling ourselves to realize that we are dependent. We are dependent, and what we actually need is a trustworthy object or subject on which to depend. And then Jesus says, that's me. The God over the economy, the God over the world, and the God over the universe. And so that's ultimately how we lean in. We anchor ourselves outside of the storm. We anchor ourselves in a way that transcends the turbulence in the storm. We anchor ourselves to Him. We bring our own principles, we rethink independence, and we anchor outside of the storm and double down and invest in and actively lean in to our relationship with God through the person of Jesus Christ. When it comes to economics, and for that matter, when it comes to everything, that's how we bring clarity in the chaos. And that's confident faith. Thanks for listening. God bless you guys.